For years, money always seemed linked to exposure. Showing your face, defending a brand, selling an image. Those who didn't accept this game were left on the sidelines, watching advertisements for easy money that rarely materialized. It was in this scenario that Ethan Walker, a 32-year-old unemployed data analyst, spent most of his days sitting in a small apartment in the suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona, with an old laptop, overdue bills, and a routine that was too quiet for someone who still considered himself productive. Unemployment didn't arrive all at once. It came in small, successive waves. First, a reduction in freelance projects, then the cancellation of contracts. Finally, the automated email informing him that the company he worked for had reorganized its priorities. No conversation, no apology, just a cold ending. Ethan closed his laptop that afternoon without making a big deal out of it. He still believed he would find another opportunity quickly. The weeks passed. Money began to disappear faster than optimism. The rent was due. The credit card was maxed out. The silence of the apartment was now broken only by bank notifications and payment reminders. Ethan wasn't irresponsible. He had always been methodical. Precisely for that reason, failure seemed heavier. He had done everything right, followed traditional advice, invested in courses, updated his resume. Nothing worked. In direct contrast to Ethan's situation, Mark Reynolds, he seemed to be thriving. A former university colleague, Mark was active on social media, posting photos in expensive cafes, openly discussing new forms of income, and making a point of showing results. Rented cars for photo shoots, strategic trips, motivational quotes accompanied by colorful graphs. To an outside observer, Mark had deciphered the modern money game. Ethan didn't trust that speech. I knew Mark well enough to know that he was always more skilled at selling ideas than executing them. Still, something bothered me. It wasn't outright envy, but a persistent doubt. What if he was right about something? On an ordinary night without expectations, Ethan spent hours browsing little-known technical forums and online communities. No popular social networks, no miraculous promises. Just fragmented discussions about automation, artificial intelligence applied to digital microtasks, and monetization models invisible to the general public. People who didn't show their faces, didn't create personal brands, and yet reported consistent earnings. The pattern began to form. It wasn't about becoming famous. It wasn't about deceiving people. It was about solving specific problems at scale, using tools that most people ignored or underestimated. Ethan realized that while many were trying to turn artificial intelligence into a spectacle, others treated it as silent infrastructure. He closed dozens of open tabs that morning, but kept 3 open. All of them described practical uses of AI behind the scenes of the internet, generating content for third parties, automating repetitive tasks, analyzing data for small businesses that didn't know how to interpret numbers. Nothing illegal, nothing glamorous, just functional. The internal conflict arose immediately. Ethan wasn't an entrepreneur by nature. He preferred predictability, clear processes, security. This required risk, albeit calculated. It required testing something without guarantees. It required accepting that for 7 days he would work without knowing if he would get any return. At the same time, there wasn't much left to lose. The next day, Ethan made a simple, almost banal decision. It would use artificial intelligence for 7 consecutive days, with a single objective: to generate money without showing its face, without creating a public profile, and without depending on an audience. If it failed, at least I would have concrete data to understand why. He quietly organized the plan. He created a basic spreadsheet. He defined clear metrics: time invested, tasks performed, responses received, values gained or lost. No guesswork. Everything would be recorded. Ethan treated the experiment as a technical project, not as a dream. Meanwhile, Mark Reynolds continued publishing eye-catching results. In one of the posts, you casually mentioned the AI revolution. and how those who don't get in now will be left behind. Ethan saw the post without reacting. For the first time, that message didn't sound like a provocation, but like distant noise. That night, the old laptop was turned on again. Ethan installed tools, organized access, and reviewed the terms of use. He didn't want illegal shortcuts or questionable strategies. His focus was on sustainable model, 7 if the initial gains were small. The clock was nearing midnight when he finished the preparations. 7 days, no promises, no inflated expectations, just execution. On the other side of town, Mark was celebrating yet another launch in a brightly lit bar, surrounded by people interested in stories of quick success. 2 distinct paths were in motion, though neither knew exactly where they would lead. Ethan closed his laptop and took a deep breath. For the first time in weeks, fear wasn't accompanied by paralysis, but by curiosity. If artificial intelligence could really generate money behind the scenes of the internet, he would find out, not through motivational videos, but through concrete results. The experiment would begin the following morning. The morning in Phoenix began dry and silent, like almost all mornings. The sun rose quickly, reflecting off the windows of the low buildings and warming the asphalt even before 8 o'clock. Ethan woke up without an alarm clock, not out of discipline, but because the weight of uncertainty had become an internal clock. He made coffee without rushing, opened his laptop, and positioned the spreadsheet in the center of the screen. The experiment had officially begun. The first detail that caught his attention was the digital environment he was entering. Unlike what was seen in popular videos, the productive underworld of the internet was discreet. Little-known platforms, simple interfaces, technical terms repeated like mantras. Nothing there seemed designed to impress. It was designed to work. Ethan began by observing small American businesses, local companies, overworked freelancers, mid-sized marketing agencies. Many of them had a poor online presence, scattered data and outdated content. There was no shortage of demand. There was a lack of structure. And that's where artificial intelligence, used discreetly, fit in perfectly. He noticed a recurring cultural pattern in the United States: efficiency over narrative. Business owners didn't want pretty stories. They wanted quick and measurable solutions. If something saved time or money, it mattered little how it was done, as long as it worked. This quiet pragmatism shaped decisions daily and created loopholes for those who knew how to operate behind the scenes. While Ethan was analyzing these opportunities, Mark Reynolds emerged as a constant counterpoint. In private messages, Mark spoke about scale, personal branding, and authority. His world revolved around perception. The more people believed in his success, the more doors opened. The curious thing was that, despite appearances, Mark depended deeply on external validation: likes, comments, invitations. Without it, his machine would grind to a halt. Ethan, on the other hand, had no audience, nor did he want one. His psychological profile was that of someone who felt comfortable being invisible as long as the system was working. AI was not a moral or social revolution for him, but a tool for leverage, something to be integrated, tested, and, if necessary, discarded. The secondary characters began to emerge indirectly. On freelance platforms, Ethan observed profiles of people who outsourced repetitive tasks: product descriptions, customer responses, data organization. Many of these profiles charged little, but were visibly overworked, working long hours to maintain minimal volumes. It was a competitive, almost invisible ecosystem, sustained by constant pressure. One name caught his attention: Linda Morales Ethan, manager of a small online store in Texas. Not because of who she was, but because of the problem she faced. Her ads had traffic but low conversion rates, confusing comments, slow responses, misinterpreted data. For Ethan, this wasn't a human failure, it was a process failure. The world he was entering operated on a micro scale: small, repeated gains, minimal adjustments, discrete automations. There was no glamour, but there was consistency. Ethan realized that the biggest barrier wasn't technical, but psychological. Most people still associated online money with public exposure, when in fact, much of the digital capital circulated far from the spotlight. Culturally, the United States favored this type of silent operation: outsourcing, automation, quick contracts. As long as there was no friction, nobody asked too many questions. Ethan carefully read terms of service, respected ethical boundaries, and avoided any practice that could be considered deceptive. His intention was not to hack the system, but to integrate into it. The contrast between him and Mark became even clearer when a message arrived. Mark was offering him a role in a new project based on public exposure and launch. Ethan read it, analyzed it, and politely declined. Not out of arrogance, but out of consistency. Their paths were already diverging. As the day progressed, Ethan felt something rare: control. Not financial control yet, but narrative control. He knew exactly what he was testing, why, and what metrics would define success or failure. The world around him remained uncertain, but the experiment was taking concrete form. At the end of the day, the spreadsheet still showed zeros. No money had been earned, no sales completed. Even so, Ethan felt no frustration. He felt alignment. The scenario was mapped out, the characters positioned, and the rules of the game understood. The next step would not be to observe, but to act. The third day of the experiment began with a clear shift in approach. Ethan stopped observing and started executing. There was no longer room for mental simulations or generic hypotheses. He chose 3 specific areas of focus, all based on the same principle: using artificial intelligence to solve operational bottlenecks that small businesses couldn't or didn't want to solve on their own. The first focus was on functional content. Not creative social media posts, but objective descriptions, automated responses, and simple reports. Ethan configured AI models to generate standardized answers to frequently asked customer questions, tailored to the tone of each business. Nothing flashy, just clear, fast, and coherent. He offered this service directly on freelancing platforms, without exaggerated promises, highlighting time savings and reduced human error. The answers took a while to arrive. The second front involved analyzing basic data. Many small American business owners collected information, sales, website traffic, clicks, without knowing how to interpret it. Ethan created a simple system. The client sent the raw data, and the AI organized patterns, highlighted anomalies, and suggested practical adjustments. These weren't complex strategic decisions, but actionable insights, something a manager could implement on the same day. Even so, the initial reaction was cold. Some ignored it, others asked about prices and disappeared. The silence began to weigh on them. The conflict was no longer just financial, but psychological. Ethan realized that despite the AI's efficiency, convincing someone to trust an invisible service required something beyond logic. On the 4th day, the first concrete response arrived, and it didn't come from the most promising source. Linda Morales replied, short, direct, almost impersonal. She wanted to test the service for a minimal amount, with no future commitment. Ethan accepted without negotiation. The goal at that moment wasn't profit, but validation. He worked for hours, refining automatic responses, adjusting the tone, ensuring nothing sounded too generic. When he sent the material, he didn't over-explain. He simply showed the before and after, with estimated metrics of time saved. Linda thanked him. Silence again. Meanwhile, Mark Reynolds was facing his own kind of conflict. A recent launch hadn't met expectations. In private messages, he complained about algorithms, platform changes, and a less engaged audience. The difference was clear. Mark depended on unstable external factors. Ethan dealt with predictable, albeit slow, systems. On the 5th day, the first bank notification appeared. A small amount, almost insignificant at first glance. But it was real money, earned without exposure, without an audience, without a public narrative. Ethan recorded it in the spreadsheet with surgical precision. He didn't celebrate. He simply confirmed the model worked. From then on, new obstacles arose. Some clients demanded constant adjustments, others didn't understand the limits of AI and expected impossible results. Ethan needed to establish clear boundaries. The technology was powerful, but not magical. Each error corrected revealed a new operational challenge. The central conflict intensified. Scale versus control. If he accepted too many orders, he would lose quality. If he was too selective, growth would be too slow to solve his immediate financial problems. Ethan adjusted prices, redefined scopes, and began refusing jobs that didn't fit the model. On the sixth day, Linda responded again. She reported a reduction in customer response time and a noticeable improvement in reviews. It wasn't enthusiastic praise, but it was concrete. She requested a larger package. Ethan adjusted the system, automated parts of the process, and delivered it in less time than he had anticipated. The money started coming in irregularly, but increasingly. Small amounts, multiple sources, nothing that would change his life immediately, but enough to alter the internal narrative. The experiment ceased to be an attempt and became an embryonic system. However, the biggest conflict didn't come from outside. It came from the temptation to expose himself. Some clients suggested he create a page, a profile, a personal brand. Ethan hesitated. He knew that this could accelerate earnings, but it would also break the central principle of the experiment. He chose to remain invisible. On the seventh day, while reviewing the spreadsheet, Ethan realized that the money earned wasn't the most relevant data. The real result lay in repeatability. He could repeat the process, adjust, scale, and all this without being seen. The conflict was no longer about whether it worked, but how far was he willing to take it. With the experiment underway, Ethan realized that the biggest challenge was no longer technical. The tools worked, the processes were clear. The real tension began to form around parallel decisions, small choices that, added together, could completely alter the course of what he was building. The first subplot emerged almost invisibly. Platform dependency. All the services Ethan offered were anchored in digital intermediaries, marketplaces, payment systems, third-party AI tools. Any rule change, any unexpected update could disrupt the income stream. He began mapping out alternatives, duplicating access, creating minimal redundancies. He wasn't seeking total independence, but resilience. At the same time, clients with distinct profiles emerged. Some wanted immediate results and pressed for answers outside the agreed-upon scope. Others saw AI as a complete replacement for human work and tried to delegate too many strategic decisions. Ethan had to learn to say no. Each refusal was a small potential loss, but also a protection for the model. The subplot of professional boundaries began to take shape. Linda Morales became a point of equilibrium. Unknowingly, she acted as a barometer. Always objective, always focused on practical results, her messages helped Ethan adjust expectations. When something worked, she expanded it. When it didn't, she cut it. There was no emotion involved, only efficiency. This silent relationship reinforced the idea that the value of AI lay in consistency, not spectacle. Meanwhile, Mark Reynolds was facing his own crisis. A recent project had been delayed, and his audience was beginning to tire of recurring promises. Mark began to observe Ethan with disguised curiosity. He asked about automation, processes, anonymous clients. For the first time, the contrast was reversed. Whoever appeared too much began to lose traction. Whoever didn't appear gained stability. This tension between visibility and invisibility became a silent narrative thread. Ethan felt the external pressure to take a public stance, but he also saw clear examples of how exposure brought volatility. Each choice reinforced the experimental nature of the journey. There were no guarantees, only consequences. Another relevant subplot emerged over time. Artificial intelligence wasn't static. Updates changed behaviors, responses, and limitations. Ethan needed to adapt prompts, revise results, and retest. What worked one day could degrade the next. The complexity wasn't in learning the tool, but in keep the system alive. Time pressure began to intensify as the rent payment approached again. The money coming in helped, but it still wasn't enough for complete security. Ethan needed to decide whether to keep the experiment as a supplement or to bet everything on it. This choice constantly hung in the air without an immediate answer. The subplots began to converge. Dependence on platforms, limits with clients, the temptation of exposure, technological instability, and financial pressure. None of them were dramatic in isolation, but together they created a field of constant tension. The narrative's pace accelerated not through major events, but through accumulation. By the end of that week, Ethan realized he wasn't just testing a way to make money, he was redesigning his relationship with work, risk, and visibility. Every small decision either pushed the system forward or weakened it. Time was becoming a critical factor. Soon, something would have to change, for better or for worse. The turning point didn't come as an explosion, nor as a dramatic announcement. It came as a glitch. On an ordinary morning, Ethan opened his laptop and found notifications he wasn't expecting. One of the platforms where he concentrated a significant portion of his services had changed its internal policies. Excessive automation would now be monitored more rigorously. Accounts could be suspended without prior notice. The message was clear, even though written in gender-neutral language. The model he had been building was vulnerable. For a few minutes, Ethan stood motionless, not out of immediate fear, but because he realized that the experiment had reached a point where past decisions were now taking their toll. The dependency he had been trying to mitigate had become concrete. If he lost that platform, he would also lose part of his newly established income stream. Instead of reacting impulsively, he analyzed the data. He identified which clients came from that specific source, which tasks could be migrated, and which processes needed to be redesigned. Artificial intelligence, until then a silent ally, was now becoming part of the problem. Not because of the technology itself, but because of how it was perceived by intermediaries. It was at that moment that an unexpected revelation emerged, not external, but internal. Ethan realized he didn't need to sell AI services. He needed to sell results. Regardless of the tool, the mistake was in positioning oneself, even subtly, as a technology operator, when one could simply have been a problem solver. The change was immediate. Ethan revamped descriptions, adjusted communications, and altered the framing of services. Artificial intelligence disappeared from the discourse. In its place, terms like process optimization, reduced operational time, and intelligent support emerged. Nothing was a lie, just a translation more aligned with the client's reality. Meanwhile, a parallel event intensified the impact of the tipping point. Mark Reynolds got in touch again, this time without enthusiasm. One of his partners had walked away after disappointing results. Mark suggested joining forces, exposure on one side, silent operation on the other. The proposal was tempting: immediate reach, more money, less anonymity. Ethan realized that this choice symbolized two opposing paths. Accepting would mean accelerating gains but losing control. Refusing would mean maintaining slow but steady growth. The turning point wasn't just the platform change, but the definition of identity. He refused. The consequence was immediate. Mark reacted with surprise, then with disguised frustration. The conversation ended without open conflict, but with a clear line drawn between them. Two incompatible models, two different rhythms. In the following days, Ethan worked intensely. He migrated clients, adjusted processes, and tested limits without drawing attention. The spreadsheet began to reflect something new: fewer chaotic entries, more predictability. The money didn't increase drastically, but it stopped fluctuating so much. The central revelation was becoming clear. The less he appeared, the more sustainable the system became. Invisibility, once a minor detail, became a strategic advantage. The turning point was complete. Ethan was no longer testing an idea. He was defending a model. The changes implemented by Ethan didn't produce immediate visible effects, but they profoundly altered the dynamics of the system he had been building. The impact didn't come in the form of explosive growth, but rather as a silent reorganization. Fewer confusing messages, fewer out-of-scope requests, less dependence on unstable platforms. In return, more clarity, more predictability, and a routine that was beginning to stabilize. Customers reacted in different ways. Some disappeared without warning, probably seeking cheaper or more eye-catching solutions. Others remained, now with more aligned expectations. Linda Morales, once again, served as a benchmark. Noticing the change in communication and processes, she reduced questions, increased the volume of delegated tasks, and began treating the service as a permanent part of the operation, not as a temporary experiment. This type of reaction confirmed something that Ethan was beginning to understand more clearly. The best customers didn't want to understand how the system worked. They just wanted it to work. AI, invisible in discourse, was becoming even more powerful in practice. It operated behind the scenes, absorbing repetitive tasks, organizing data, and freeing up human time for more relevant decisions. On a personal level, the consequences also began to manifest. Ethan started structuring his days differently. He set schedules, service limits, and review cycles. The initial chaos gave way to an austere, almost industrial routine. There was no euphoria, but there was measurable progress. Each day ended with small but consistent numbers. Mark Reynolds reacted in the opposite way. After the refusal, his contact became sporadic. Vague messages, comments about new strategies, and attempts at repositioning. The wear and tear of constant exposure was beginning to show. The audience no longer reacted as before, and the releases required increasing effort to generate the same return. The contrast between the two approaches became more evident with each indirect interaction. Financial pressure had lessened but not disappeared. Ethan still hadn't achieved complete security. However, something essential had changed: his emotional dependence on immediate money. He now possessed a system that could be adjusted, improved, and replicated. This transformed each challenge into a controllable variable, not an existential threat. The consequences of the tipping point were also reflected in how Ethan viewed artificial intelligence itself. Before, it was the center of the experiment. Now it was just a component. Important, yes, but replaceable if necessary. The real value lay in the logic of the process, in reading needs, and in the ability to adapt. External reactions continued to emerge. Some clients inquired about expansion, others suggested referrals. Ethan accepted few. He preferred gradual growth to overload. Each new entry was carefully evaluated. The temptation to accelerate remained, but now it was controlled by clear criteria. At the end of that phase, Ethan realized that the greatest effect of his recent decisions wasn't in the spreadsheet numbers, but in the change in his attitude. He had stopped reacting to his environment and had begun to shape it within his own limits. The story progressed quietly, but with a firm direction. The consequences were clear. The next step would require more than technical adjustments. It would require real personal growth. Growth did not come with comfort. On the contrary, as the system stabilized, new challenges arose, more subtle and demanding than the previous ones. It was no longer enough to make artificial intelligence work. It was necessary to evolve, along with the model itself that Ethan had created. The first obstacle was personal limitation. Ethan realized he was still centralizing too many decisions. Every adjustment, every delivery, every validation went through him. The system worked, but it depended excessively on his attention. If he got sick or needed to be absent, everything would stop. This bottleneck became evident when two clients requested simultaneous changes within tight deadlines. The answer wasn't to work longer hours, but to work differently. Ethan began documenting processes, creating checklists, and establishing clear standards. Artificial intelligence ceased to be merely an executor and began operating within well-defined workflows. Human work, in turn, became about supervision and decision-making, not repetitive execution. This change marked an important internal growth. Ethan gradually abandoned the mindset of a lone operator and assumed the posture of a systems architect. It wasn't an overt transformation, but it was visible in his actions. Less improvisation, more structure. Another challenge emerged in the form of temptation. With more predictable results, opportunities for rapid expansion arose. Partnerships, larger packages, exclusive offers. Each promised immediate gains, but demanded concessions, more exposure, more dependence, less control. Ethan coldly analyzed them all and rejected most. This ability to say no represented a different kind of overcoming, not the fight against scarcity, but against excess. True growth, he realized, lay in choosing the right pace, not the fastest one. On an emotional level, something was also falling into place. The constant anxiety, previously fueled by financial uncertainty, was beginning to give way to a quiet confidence. It wasn't naive optimism, but the confidence of someone who understands their own process. Each result reinforced the idea that the system didn't depend on luck, but on consistent execution. Linda Morales extended the contract again. No praise, no excessive enthusiasm, just continuity. For Ethan, that was more significant than any public statement. It represented real validation, not a performance. Mark Reynolds, on the other hand, began to disappear from the radar. His publications became less frequent, more generic. The luster of his exposure was beginning to fade. The difference between sustainable growth and performance growth was becoming increasingly clear. The final breakthrough in this phase was internal. Ethan accepted that the invisible model wouldn't make him famous or publicly admired, and that ceased to matter. The goal had never been recognition, but autonomy. And that was beginning to materialize. The growth was complete not because the numbers had exploded, but because the system now survived without urgency. Ethan was no longer chasing money. He was drawn to it by consistency. With the system stabilized and the routine defined, Ethan entered a different phase of the journey. There was no more improvisation or open experimentation. Every action now had a clear purpose, and every decision was made based on data accumulated over the previous days. What had once been an experiment was gradually becoming a consolidated operation. The subplots began to resolve themselves quietly. The excessive reliance on platforms decreased when Ethan diversified inbound channels and standardized deliveries. He no longer needed to accept every request that came his way. The system filtered for him. Misaligned clients simply didn't move forward. This reduced friction and increased overall efficiency. Technological instability also ceased to be a constant threat. Ethan began to anticipate changes, revising processes before they became obsolete. Artificial intelligence was updated, tested, and integrated almost automatically. The focus was no longer on the tool, but on the workflow. If one piece failed, another would take its place. The narrative tension, however, did not disappear. It changed form. The next step required a decision that could not be easily undone: scale up or stay lean. Scaling meant more revenue, but also more complexity. Staying lean meant stability. but a clear growth ceiling. Time was pressing again, not out of desperation, but out of opportunity. Ethan began receiving spontaneous referrals. Satisfied clients recommended his service to others without him even asking. Demand was growing organically, and indiscriminately rejecting it could mean missing a strategic moment. He carefully reviewed the spreadsheet. For the first time, the numbers showed something different. Consistent projections. They weren't impressive figures, but they were sustainable. If he slightly adjusted the volume and maintained the standards, he could turn that model into his main source of income. Meanwhile, Mark Reynolds briefly reappeared on the digital scene. A low-key announcement, lacking the enthusiasm of before. The final contrast was beginning to emerge. Exposure no longer seemed like an advantage. The noise had become a burden. Ethan felt no satisfaction upon noticing this, only confirmation. The invisible path, slower and less glamorous, proved more resistant to wear and tear. That night, Ethan did something he hadn't done since the beginning of the experiment. He turned off his laptop before midnight. Not out of tiredness, but out of confidence. The system would work the next day without urgent adjustments. This simple detail signaled that something had profoundly changed. The preparations were complete. The stage was set. The pending decisions had been reduced to a single central question. The next move would define the ultimate course of the story. The climax was near. The climax didn't present itself as an unexpected external event, but as an inevitable decision. After weeks of operating at a controlled limit, Ethan realized that keeping the system exactly as it was would leave everything stagnant. There would be no collapse, but there would also be no real progress. The stability, once desired, had now become a ceiling. The decision came with a practical twist. A group of small businesses, recommended by Linda Morales, contacted her almost simultaneously. They all faced the same problem: overly manual processes, slow responses, and ignored data. Separately, each request would be manageable. Together, they represented something bigger, the chance to transform the invisible model into a scalable system without losing anonymity. Ethan saw this as the ultimate test. He didn't raise prices abruptly or promise extraordinary results. Instead, he did something different. He created a closed, standardized model. A single service with a clear scope, recurring delivery, and well-defined limits. Those who accepted would enter. Those who didn't accept would be left out. For the first time, Ethan wasn't adapting to the client. The client was adapting to the system. The turnaround was immediate. Some refused, others accepted without negotiation. The initial volume dropped, but efficiency skyrocketed. Artificial intelligence, now fully integrated into the workflows, operated in the background with minimal supervision. Ethan's role was definitively transformed. He no longer performed tasks, only monitored critical decisions. The protagonist's turning point became clear when he realized he could step away for hours without anything breaking. The system continued to function. Inputs were processed, deliveries happened, payments arrived automatically. What had begun as a 7-day experiment had become an autonomous machine. During the same period, Mark Reynolds was facing the collapse of a launch. Negative comments surfaced. Partners distanced themselves. The public, once enthusiastic, now questioned old promises. The exposure, which had previously amplified gains, amplified failures. Ethan observed from a distance, without judgment. The climax wasn't Mark's downfall, but the definitive confirmation that his own path was irreversible. There was no turning back from the search for public validation. There was no need to show up. The irreversible consequence solidified when Ethan cancelled his presence on platforms that encouraged visibility. He removed descriptions, simplified profiles, and concentrated everything on discrete channels. That decision closed doors, but it shielded the system. At the end of that day, Ethan updated the spreadsheet one last time. The projected monthly amount exceeded any income he had ever earned from traditional jobs. It wasn't a momentary peak. It was recurring. The climax was complete. The central conflict, making money online without showing your face, had been resolved in a concrete, practical, and sustainable way. Nothing else needed to be proven. With the conflict resolved and the system operating autonomously, Ethan's life entered a phase that at first glance seemed less dramatic, but was profoundly different from anything he had experienced before. The changes weren't visible to an outside observer. There was no announcement, celebration, or public validation. Yet the impact was real and lasting. The consequences of the decisions made throughout the experiment began to solidify in the medium term. The income stream remained stable. It didn't grow explosively, but it withstood the test of time, market fluctuations, and platform changes. When a tool altered rules or limited functionalities, the system adjusted. The artificial intelligence was replaced, recalibrated, or redistributed without compromising operations. Customers began to treat the service as infrastructure. They no longer asked how it worked, only when it would be available. For Ethan, this represented the highest level of professional trust. He had ceased to be a reactive service provider and had become a structural element of the third-party business, invisible yet indispensable. Linda Morales expanded her operation based on the efficiency she had gained. She reduced costs, increased conversion rates, and began delegating new areas of the business. She never mentioned artificial intelligence publicly. For her, it wasn't innovation, but a silent competitive advantage. Ethan realized that this behavior was repeated in other clients. Real success didn't need a narrative. On a personal level, the consequences were even more profound. Ethan stopped measuring his worth by the time invested or the exposure achieved. Work ceased to occupy the center of his identity and began to fulfill a clear function, to sustain autonomy. He could choose when to work, how much to grow, and what risks to take. The stark contrast with Mark Reynolds became evident without the need for confrontation. Mark kept seeking repositioning, alternating discourses and formats, always reacting to the environment. Ethan, on the other hand, had built something that didn't depend on constant attention. A system that survived even in the absence of its creator. The world of the story had clearly been transformed, not because the internet had changed, but because the way of operating within it had become more mature, less noisy, and more efficient. The conclusion offered not euphoria, but clarity. Ethan hadn't found a shortcut. He had built a method. Months later, Ethan walked through the same quiet apartment where it had all begun. The laptop remained the same, old and unassuming, but now it was merely an interface, not a point of tension. The system ran in the background, fulfilling its function without requiring constant presence. He was unknown. He had no audience. He wasn't a public authority on artificial intelligence, yet the money flowed in regularly, sustained by invisible processes and well-defined decisions. The 7-day experiment had ceased to be a test and had become a permanent foundation. Outside, the digital world remained noisy. New promises emerged. New trends vied for attention. Ethan observed everything from a distance, with no urgency to participate. Invisibility, after all, had become his greatest advantage. If this story made you rethink how money is actually generated on the internet, perhaps the main point isn't artificial intelligence itself, but how it is used. Most people still believe that making money online requires exposure, exaggerated promises, or well-constructed personas. The reality, as you've seen, can be quite different. There are silent, sustainable, and replicable models happening right now, far from the spotlight. Understanding these behind-the-scenes aspects is what separates curiosity from results. If you want to continue exploring real stories, practical strategies, and little-known paths to online income, technology, and digital empowerment, subscribe to the channel. Share in the comments what caught your attention most on this journey and how you imagine applying these lessons to your own reality. The conversation doesn't end here.